ever noticed how easy it is to drift through life focused on what's right in front of you? Your job, your goals, your comfort, without really asking what any of it adds up to? We spend so much time trying to secure our own footing that we rarely stop to ask whether we're actually building something that matters beyond ourselves. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the 3rd Sunday of Easter, we'll explore what it means to live a life defined not by accumulation or survival, but by integrity, accountability, and the kind of connection that turns ordinary moments into something meaningful. In this episode, we're asking a simple question. Being that our time is limited, what are we actually doing with it? And who are we becoming in the process? Are we building a life that reflects what we say we value, or just one that feels comfortable in the moment? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the 3rd Sunday of Easter, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as history books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the 3rd Sunday of Easter, Cycle A. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. It's chapter 2, verses 14 and verses 22 through 33. Our second reading is from 1 Peter. It's chapter 1, verses 17 through 21. And our gospel reading is from Luke. It's chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages in the main lesson in each one, and finally we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. With that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. "Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. David said about him, 'I saw the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest in hope, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead. You will not let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence.' Fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. But he was a prophet and knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing what was to come, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, that he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. And our second reading is from 1 Peter. Beloved, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him. And so your faith and hope are in God. And our gospel reading is from Luke. Now that same day 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Acts of the Apostles, and what stands out in this passage isn't just what's being said, it's how it's being said. And according to the story, Peter isn't just making some sort of blind proclamation. He's presenting an argument that's built on shared experience, shared memory, and a common understanding of the world. And when you strip away the supernatural framing, what you're left with is a powerful example of public reasoning. Someone trying to persuade a community by connecting the dots in a way that makes sense to them. Now that matters, because Real change doesn't happen when people are told what to believe. Real change happens when they're invited to think and question and see something differently together. There's also a moment here that's easy to gloss over, but I think it's incredibly important. The idea of collective responsibility. The crowd is confronted with its role in something unjust, the crucifixion of Jesus, an innocent man. It's not as they're not confronted as isolated individuals, but as part of a system that allowed this harm to happen. And that sort of direct confrontation to a group and a system is a bit uncomfortable for most people. It's always easier to point fingers outward than it is to look at how we might be complicit in the structures around us. But growth, both personal and societal growth, requires that sort of honesty. It requires the willingness to say, wow, we were part of this. All right, now what are we going to do about it? And then there's this thread of legacy running underneath the whole speech. It's the contrast between someone who lived and died and someone whose influence continues. For us, it's not about literal resurrection. It's about impact. The truth is, none of us escapes the limits of time. But what we do with that time, how we treat people, what we stand for, what we build, those things can ripple outward long after we're gone. And the shift we see here from fear to courage, from silence to speaking out, I should remind us that those ripples, well, they often start with someone deciding that, you know what, staying quiet, it's not an option anymore. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that we endure through the justice we pursue and the impact we leave behind. At its core, this passage challenges us to think about what it means to live a life that matters. Not in terms of longevity, but in terms of influence. It asks us to take responsibility for the world that we're part of, to engage honestly with others, and to have the courage to stand for something beyond our own comfort. Because in the end, what lasts isn't the breath we keep, it's the difference we make. We endure through the justice we pursue and the impact we leave behind. Our second reading was from 1 Peter, and at the heart of this passage is a simple but demanding idea. Fairness ain't optional. Fairness is foundational. Strip away all the theological stuff, and what you're left with is a call to live by consistent standards, regardless of who benefits. No favoritism, no exceptions for status or wealth or influence. And that's a hell of a lot harder than it sounds, because most systems, hear me on this, most systems, whether they're social, political, economic, most systems are built to reward some people more than others. This challenges us to step outside of that and ask, do we actually treat people with the same level of dignity and accountability, or do we sometimes bend the rules when it's convenient or easier to do so? There's also this underlying reminder that our time is limited. The language about living out our time on earth as foreigners, it doesn't have to be seen as something mystical. It can simply point to the reality that we don't get forever. And when you really stop to reflect on that, it can change how you prioritize things. It puts pressure, in a good way, on how you spend your time, how you treat people, and what you choose to invest your energy in. Not out of fear of punishment, but out of respect for the fact that this life is finite. And because of that, this life is incredibly valuable. And then there's the contrast between material wealth and human value. Silver and gold are described as perishable, and they are. They can lose value, they get traded. Hell, they disappear sometimes, but the impact of a life lived with integrity, that's something else entirely. It can be much more imperishable. It shows up in how people remember you, how your actions influence others, and how your example shapes the choices of the people around you. We don't need perfection to make an impact, but we do need consistency. People pay attention to how we live, not just what we say occasionally. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that true worth is measured by integrity, not accumulation. This passage invites us to rethink what actually matters, not in theory, but in practice. It asks us to live with fairness, to respect the limited time we have, and to prioritize people over possessions in a world that constantly pushes us in the opposite direction. What defines us isn't what we've gathered. It's how we've lived. True worth is measured by integrity, not accumulation. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Luke. And what's striking about this story is how deeply human it is. You've got people trying to make sense of something that shattered their expectations. And at first, they can't see clearly. Not because they're incapable, but because they're overwhelmed. That's how it works. When we're in the middle of confusion or loss, our perspective tends to really narrow. And what shifts things here isn't a sudden revelation from above. It's conversation. That's where it begins. It's the act of talking things through, questioning, reframing, and gradually building understanding together. That's what they did on the road to Emmaus. That's how we process reality. Not in isolation, but in dialogue with other people, especially people with different perspectives. Then there's this moment of hospitality that changes everything. The travelers don't just tolerate the stranger. They invite him in. They share a meal. They make space at the table. And that's where things open up. There's something powerful about that willingness to engage with someone outside your immediate circle, especially when you're not even sure what they bring to the table. Because more often than not, insight doesn't come from staying in our comfort zones. Insight comes from encountering different perspectives, different experiences, and being open enough to let those things challenge us. And finally, the realization itself doesn't happen through argument or proof. It happens in a shared physical moment. Breaking bread, eating together. It's simple, almost ordinary, but that's the point. The things that bind us most deeply aren't usually abstract ideas. What binds us are shared experiences. The aha moment comes when everything clicks into place, when the conversation, the connection, and the experience all suddenly align. And that feeling, the excitement of understanding, the realization that something finally makes sense, that's one of the most powerful drivers of growth that we have available to us. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that insight grows through shared dialogue and human connection. This story reminds us that clarity doesn't come from going it alone. Clarity comes from engaging with others, being open to new perspectives, and creating spaces where understanding can just emerge naturally. It challenges us to listen more, to welcome more, and to recognize that some of the most meaningful insights in our lives will come through connection, not through certainty. Insight grows through shared dialogue and human connection. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Acts of the Apostles, the main lesson I came away with was, we endure through the justice we pursue and the impact we leave behind. In our second reading from 1 Peter, the main lesson I got was, true worth is measured by integrity, not accumulation. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was, insight grows through shared dialogue and human connection. These readings all seem to be pointing in the same direction, which is away from the idea that life is about holding on to what's ours and toward something much bigger. It's not about how much we accumulate or how long we last. It's about what we leave behind in the people around us. It's about taking responsibility for the systems we're part of, choosing fairness, even when it costs us something, and being willing to sit at the table with others, especially when it would be easier to just stay in our own lane. Because meaning doesn't come from survival alone. Meaning comes from how we live with integrity, how we stand for what's right, and how we build real connection with the people sharing this short, complicated life with us. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because right now we're struggling to even agree on what's real. Everyone's got their own version of the truth, and we retreat into our own corners, only listening to the voices that already agree with us. That's not sustainable for a society. If we can't learn how to engage each other using shared reality, facts, history, evidence, then we don't just lose arguments, we lose the ability to function as a society. Moving beyond tribal talking points and actually reasoning together, it's not optional. That's the baseline for getting anything done. These lessons are important because we've tied human value to money in ways that are really just quietly distorting everything. We say we value people, but when we measure success almost entirely by income, status, and accumulation, do we really value people? And when that becomes the standard, integrity gets pushed to the side because integrity doesn't always pay. This is a direct challenge to that mindset. These lessons force us to ask whether we actually believe that people matter more than profit, or if that's just something we say to sound good when it's convenient. We should care about this because loneliness is everywhere, even though we're constantly connected. The truth is, scrolling, liking, and commenting, they aren't the same as sitting across from someone, sharing a meal, and actually engaging. Real understanding, real connection requires us to be present. It requires openness to people who think differently, who live differently, who see the world differently. Without that, we don't just stay isolated. We also stay stuck. This is important because accountability has unfortunately become very selective, even more so than it has been in the past. We hold some people to high standards and others just get a free pass. But it's usually based on whether they're on our side or not. But fairness doesn't work like that. If we're serious about justice, then it has to apply across the board, especially to people in power. Otherwise, all our talk about values, just a bunch of noise. This matters because it calls us out. It pushes us to stop prioritizing comfort, to stop avoiding hard conversations, and start taking responsibility for what we believe, how we live, and how we treat the people around us. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, we've been talking about truth, integrity, and connection, but those ideas only matter if they actually show up in how we live our lives. And if we're being completely honest, most of us have at least one area of our lives where we know what the right thing is, and we're choosing the easier thing instead. Not because we're bad people, but because comfort is very appealing, and changing course usually costs us something. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. In what area of my life am I currently prioritizing my own comfort or perishable success over a difficult truth or an act of radical hospitality? Now, this question matters because it moves us out of theory and into action. It forces us to identify where we might be avoiding responsibility, whether that's overlooking something that might be unjust or staying silent when we should speak up. Maybe we're keeping our distance when someone could genuinely use our time, attention, or our support. Now, this is a tough one for me, this question. And in what area of my life am I currently prioritizing my own comfort or perishable success over a difficult truth or an act of radical hospitality? But for me, it's my own comfort over a difficult truth. Because if I'm being honest, I'm not always sure I get it right. Last year, when Donald Trump took office again, things changed quickly for federal employees, and not in a good way. Programs that helped people who genuinely needed support were being gutted, including the digital accessibility program I had spent years building. 2/3 of my team were gone overnight. The rest of us were forced back into the office after 5 years of highly effective remote work. Literal award-winning remote work. Some of my team had never even worked in one of our offices before because they'd been hired during the pandemic. And at 58 years old, I found myself back making an hour and 45-minute commute each way, going to a job that the leadership clearly didn't value or support. It started taking a real toll. A physical toll on me. My knees, my feet, my lower back. It wasn't just annoying. It was causing serious medical problems. My doctor told me pretty plainly that the commute was doing real, potentially permanent damage. At the same time, I was watching decisions being made that I couldn't reconcile with my own sense of right and wrong. So I made the call to take the deferred resignation program, and I retired at the end of the year. On the surface, it felt like a decision rooted in conscience. I didn't want to be part of something that was actively undermining work I believed in. But here's the part that still nags at me. Was that really about principle, or was it about comfort? If I truly believed in the mission, should I have stayed? I pushed through the physical strain, endured the frustration, so that I'd be in a position to help rebuild when things finally changed? I don't have a clear answer to that. And maybe that's the point. Questions like this don't always resolve themselves neatly, but they do force you to stay honest with yourself. They keep you from drifting into easy justifications. And if nothing else, they help you make your next decision with your eyes a little more open than the last one. So here's the question again. In what area of my life am I currently prioritizing my own comfort or perishable success over a difficult truth or an act of radical hospitality? When you answer this honestly, it gives you something a bit more concrete to work with. Maybe it means having a difficult conversation you've been avoiding. opening your home or your time to someone outside your usual circle, or rethinking how you measure success in your work or your finances. Small changes in these areas can lead to stronger relationships, clearer decision-making, and a deeper sense that your life actually aligns with what you say you value the most. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. French philosopher and novelist Albert Camus once wrote, "Integrity has no need of rules." At first glance, that might sound a little unsettling. We like rules. Rules give us clarity and structure, and if we're being honest, rules give us a way to justify our decisions without really having to wrestle with them too much. But what Camus is pointing to is something deeper. Real integrity doesn't come from following a checklist of right actions. Real integrity comes from the internal process of questioning, weighing, and then choosing, especially when there isn't a clean, clear answer. That's exactly where our question comes from this week. When you ask yourself whether you're choosing comfort over truth, or whether you're avoiding an act of real connection because it's inconvenient, you're not looking for a rule to tell you what to do. You're stepping into that uncomfortable space where you have to be honest with yourself. And as my story hopefully showed, sometimes even after you make the decision, the question doesn't go away. You don't get a neat resolution. You're left holding both possibilities. Maybe it was principle, maybe it was comfort. And you have to live with that tension. But here's the important part. That tension, that isn't a failure of integrity. I believe the presence of that tension is evidence of integrity. The fact that you're still asking the question, you're still examining your own motives, still refusing to give yourself an easy out, that's the work. That's what it looks like to take your values seriously. Not as slogans or memes, but as something you actively try to live out. And that's why our question matters so much, because it keeps you engaged in that process. It keeps you honest. And over time, that kind of honesty shapes how you show up in the world far more than any simple rule ever could. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week. But in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week. And pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the third Sunday of Easter, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that meaning comes from how we live with integrity, how we stand for what's right, and how we build real connection with the people sharing this short, complicated life with us. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV. Copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc. Used by permission, all rights reserved, worldwide. Thank you again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com. mythologizingthebible.com.